Hello, everybody. Welcome, 3 p.m. Eastern. Scott Maier here with Artist Network, and this is Drawing Together. So if you're new, you're going to want to know that this show is all about us getting together to draw together because it takes kind of focus and intention to grow as artists. So we do that every Wednesday. We take some time out of our busy lives to challenge ourselves with specific subjects that advance our skills in particular ways. So there's a list of materials in the description below. You can also find a link to the reference image where you can follow along. I want to shout out to everybody, all the familiar names there. I want to say happy birthday to Edie. Tomorrow's your birthday, so hope that goes well. Oh no, I'm sorry, Michelle. Edie, you were saying your happy birthday to Michelle. So happy birthday. So again, I want to thank you all for being here. I'm going to be talking through the process that I followed as I complete this drawing today, but I encourage you to find your own path and share that with all of us as well. Ask any questions you'd like. If you type your questions in all caps, I'm more likely to see it. And if I do miss a question, please just repeat it so that I'm sure to answer it, because sometimes the chat gets going and I miss it. And I don't want to do that. So yes, and if you would please be so kind as to hit the like button if you in fact enjoy the show, hit the subscribe and things so that you can stay up to date with all the live stuff that we do here on Artist Network. So we're working on developing new programming as well, keeping drawing sessions going, but hopefully incorporating some painting and pastel, watercolor, etc., to kind of expand the range a little bit. But drawing is a very fundamental skill, and I get asked quite a bit if you have to learn how to draw in order to paint. And it's certainly helpful to have some drawing experience. I would hate to have that inhibit you from painting if you feel so inclined to start just moving paint around. But at the same time, what experience drawing can do is it can help build hand-eye coordination. It can help really primarily just focus your mind a little bit, especially on some of the questions that we may not ask ourselves or kind of be intuitively asking ourselves as we go along. So I want to be addressing that as we go throughout the drawing. But we want to get to the drawing. So let's take a look at the subject today. Again, you'll find a link to the reference image in the description below. Drawing this Moonrise image here. Now, I chose to work on the toned paper. So this is a gray toned rag paper. This is a little bit larger than an 8 by 10. So it's about an 8.8 by 11 or something like that. So I just kind of scaled it up a little bit. I'll be working with charcoal. I'll leave that here for now. But the charcoal I'll be working with, I got vine charcoal. Plus a white charcoal for some of the highlight areas in the moon. And then I have a hard and a 6B extra soft compressed charcoal pencil. These are both really excellent tools to be using. Really enjoy the General's charcoal pencils. This is also the Faber-Castell Pitt charcoal. Those are both excellent. If you are looking for a really awesome intro set to get you going, I took it out of its package, but this General's drawing pencil kit is really a great one. So it has the charcoal you need. It has excellent graphite pencils as well as graphite sticks. So check that out if you just want to get going and you want good materials to work with. Okay, other materials. Erasers. I have my Kneaded eraser and my trusty Derwent retractable eraser, which I have shaved down to this chisel tip to give myself a certain amount of precision and control. And then finally, blending. I've got my 3 now trusty blending implements. My paper towel here, if you have just a rag or something. I just like paper towels. I have this well-used blending stump. I've been using this. I think it's the same one for well over a year now, and I love the dirtier it gets. So I keep having to reshape the tip because you can see it's getting a little bit blunt there at the front, but you can kind of reshape them. And then I introduced this a couple weeks ago. This is the Dynasty brush. This IPC1 is a great blending brush. It's a very stiff yet soft brush. So you can see that it's got some spring to it. It's got this tapered point. I've got a few of them. This one I've been using primarily with charcoal. And so I'm going to be using that for some blending things. Okay. if you have whatever materials you have, go for it. Even if you know you're going to be coming back to this drawing later with charcoal, just kind of working through the process of kind of deconstructing this image can be helpful. So don't be inhibited from drawing if you don't have what I have. There's a lot of things that we'll be covering that will be applicable to what you are using. Some of the things that I really want to be focusing on. In this preparatory drawing, it really helped me to think through blending as a key element. So creating a smooth gradation or a relatively smooth gradation. I think I have a lot of room to grow in that area, so we'll hopefully kind of practice that. And the other thing that I want to really focus more on is dropping the value here. I really punched up the contrast in the landscape here, and I think it creates a softness that is interesting. But in terms of really capturing that time of day, this kind of twilight scene with a moon rising, I think I want to try dropping that value. So we'll be playing around with value relationships, soft and edges, so lost and found edges to help convey a sense of atmosphere and light, a lot of those things. We will be working on proportion control, but that's less of a critical factor in this image. You could scale up the moon, as you see I did here. The moon is larger in my drawing than it is in the reference. It's also a little bit closer to the horizon. So have fun playing with this. I think you can kind of get away with a certain amount of inaccuracy with regards to proportions and instead focus really on value control. So that is kind of my take on this whole thing. And now I should get going. All right, let's see. If anybody does have any questions, be sure to shout it out. If you're new, I want to welcome you. Tell all your friends this is a safe place to come and draw and enjoy it. So, as with any drawing, it kind of starts with an initial gesture. So what is a gesture? A gesture is kind of a simple reaction to the form. I have a large scale version of the reference up here to my left. And I have the small one, the screen that you're looking at, I have directly in front of me. That's what I'm going to be looking at. And I'm going to be looking at that because the smaller the thumbnail, the more it compels me to focus on just primary shapes and not get absorbed in details. Details are very challenging for me to address early on in a drawing. I've been drawing for over 25 years with intention, and it's always been something that I've battled is how to manage details, and I've come to reconsider the term details and try to use the term refinement more so, but early on, it's so easy to get absorbed in especially texture and some of these kind of really sensuous detail areas. But early on, if you can focus on just the general shapes, and in this case, we really just have, just a few real kind of critical forms. So this is a relatively simple subject. Now, I'm going to start off addressing the moon as much as I can as a shape, as a negative space, rather than a line. And so there's going to be a certain amount of kind of pantomiming. That's a term I've borrowed from Brent Eveston. Check out his courses, the Art and Science of Drawing series, if you're looking for another source to help you with your drawing. But I love that term, pantomiming, as you're just kind of practicing marks. And so I'm just... so I work around the placement and the size of the moon. I'm just going to be kind of lightly pantomiming the motion, and then trying to build that shape less through the creation of a line and more through just simply leaving a circular shape bare on the paper around a field of fine charcoal here. So this fine charcoal is a great material to work through some of these initial thoughts. So kind of thinking through composition, thinking through the basic form, kind of getting warmed up, loosening up, just kind of putting the brain in the right spot. And critically, it helps to prepare the surface for compressed charcoal on top. So what I have found is when I go to directly onto the paper with compressed charcoal, sometimes it grabs it a little bit more than I'd like it to, and it's harder to release. But if you kind of flood it with vine charcoal initially, it helps to prepare that surface. Oh, Edie, that's a great point in terms of reshaping the blending stump using a straightened paper clip. I used a thin paintbrush to poke mine out earlier. It wasn't quite sharp enough, but that's what left this kind of blunted turn. Because I had pushed this all the way in, it was just flat, and it really didn't do much good for me. So I took the thinnest thing I could find here was a small detail paintbrush handle. But I think a paper clip is definitely something you just need to keep on hand for that to get that nice fine point. All right, so right off the bat now that we have just kind of an initial study in very quickly, I can use the palm of my hand to kind of lightly wash this in. This is all very delicate. Even with the vine charcoal as I'm laying it down, you can see how much I'm picking up with my fingertips because I'm actually kind of resisting a bit with the fingertips and then gradually lowering it onto the page to find a pressure that works. And here I can just use the weight of the charcoal to leave some marks. And I'm hardly making any marks, and that's fine. I'd rather come at the creation of this image through the creation of the use of many, many light layers than try to get that right value right out of the gate. But at this point, I have the basic landscape established. And the way I've started to kind of refine the process of my drawing is to break it down into 4 main parts. That's what I used in my book, the See, Think, Draw book right over there. So if you're looking for a book, See, Think, Draw, that comes out in June. It's available for pre-order now. But what I did is I tried to break it down into kind of a basic progression of decisions that you make or questions that you might ask yourself. So if you start with a gesture, the point of this stage is to simply get information on the page. Now we have something that we can react to. And we may be able to make some big decisions about the overall composition. So right now, if I look at this feels very high relative to the reference image. The moon feels rather large. So I need to ask myself what I want to do about that. And maybe I don't know now, but maybe I'll discover that throughout the process. With the vine charcoal, I can make some very quick editorial statements, and I can play around with some of these rough marks without having to commit to them yet. And I want to see what happens to maybe if I leave the moon as it is, but drop the landscape down slightly. And maybe I end up kind of cropping it differently than the way the photograph is cropped. And I can play around with some of these ideas without having committed a significant amount of time to the drawing. Now, I do like that. I like the space between the moon and the hillside there a bit more. It helps to emphasize that upward lift. And it's more so, I've really pushed that more here at this stage than I did with the preparatory sketch. And if I play around with the scale of the moon, it plays around with our overall perceptions and our relationship to the landscape. So as a landscape painter, I think a lot about scale of things, especially here in Colorado, where we have distant mountains that are enormous, but they take up a very small portion of our field of vision. And how can we use scale to convey a sense of the space that we're actively in? So as we shrink the moon, that plays that has an effect on the scale of the landscape, and it plays a part in how we envision ourselves in relationship to that landscape, if that makes sense. You can take something that is very far away and bring it forward. That's something that I like to do a lot in my paintings. You can take something that's very far forward and try to make it feel more distant. And like I said early on, we have the choice here to control our relationship to the reference image. Do we want it to look exactly like the reference? And that can be a skill that we focus on developing today, getting that scale exactly correct. Or do we want to build the muscles for kind of reinterpreting the landscape and get used to that and seeing how we can kind of subtly tweak and push things to convey a certain kind of emotional quality to the piece. So that may be a little bit abstract, but I wanted to kind of talk through some of the things I think about early on. It's a little bit easier to think about at these early stages because, again, those are big decisions that I can focus on without being bogged down by the kind of the seductive quality of details. So let's see. It looks like there's a question. Oh, yes. Michelle, the difference between willow and vine, they're essentially the same thing in terms of their practical application. They feel very similar to one another. One might be a little bit softer, one might be a little bit harder, but I use them interchangeably for essentially the same result. But essentially, when you're looking at vine charcoal, it is carbonized, burnt grapevines, and you're looking at willow. These are willow branches that are they're essentially being baked in a kiln and reducing the amount of oxygen so it doesn't just turn into ash, but it actually turns into a usable piece of charcoal. So, and those are very soft woods that evaporate out any of the liquid content in them, and it creates this nice soft drawing material. I don't actually remember what I have right here. But sometimes you'll actually experience natural imperfections, and I come to really like those. Sometimes you hit a little knot in the wood, and it'll scratch your paper a little bit. That just makes it a fun experience to try to adapt to it. Now, here I'm just kind of softening things with the vine charcoal. I'm pretty sure this is vine charcoal, not willow. But actually, you know what? I should be precise. Here it is. Oh, it's willow charcoal. This is Creative Mark willow charcoal that I'm using. And I like it. It's good stuff. So I believe that's the Jerry's Artorama brand. So check that out. I think it works very well. So I should correct that on my screen. It is willow charcoal. Good question. Marison. Welcome. Glad you could join us today. If you are new, you can find all the old episodes. This is 143, so there's 142 previous episodes that are up on our YouTube channel. You can jump in anywhere, just kind of draw along, because again, this is all about us just dedicating some of our time to drawing and seeing how we can focus on either one skill or a set of skills with a certain amount of intention, so that we grow more effectively as artists. If we can apply this to painting or whatever you choose to do as an artist. So, Robert, you can certainly do this on college ruled paper. I think whatever materials you have, go for it. Don't ever be inhibited from drawing because you don't have the right materials. Now, having said that, it's going to give you a very different result, but I still think there's going to be a lot that you can learn by working on, printer paper, college ruled paper. If you have a pen, go for it. All right. And see what you can take from this. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, if you do have vine charcoal and I'm actually using willow or willow versus vine, don't worry about it. All right. So I'm actually going to take my paper towel, going to smooth this all out, just a light pressure. And I want to walk you through some of the steps that I use to try to control the gradations in a work. Okay, so I'm going to stick with the vine charcoal. And if you're new, what you may be observing now is that I'm not using lines to create a foundation for the drawing. I'm building up these large masses. And I'm intentionally approaching it with these soft edges because the drawing process for me is about starting the drawing with generalized shapes and gradually becoming more specific and refining those edges, adding kind of details and refinement as we go through. So starting from a place where everything almost feels blurred and out of focus, and ending at something that is more sharply focused. And the reason I do that is because that aligns with the progress that I make as I'm observing the scene. So right now, my eyes are out of focus. I'm looking at the reference as though it's just all a blob, right? And it may not look at it, but if you squint your eyes, it'll achieve the same thing. But I'm just letting my eyes relax focus. When you squint, that's another way of achieving the same result. It reduces the amount of light that enters your eyes. It shuts down any sort of observation of details. So you see basic value shapes and masses more directly. All right. So right now, my understanding of the form is relatively general. And through the drawing process, I will become more acquainted with the subject. I'll have a deeper understanding of it, and then that's going to show in the drawing. So I'm using that drawing to arrive at a deeper understanding, and then that deeper understanding feeds back into the drawing to make the drawing stronger. So that's what I'm seeing here. That's why I'm building up these marks, and then I'm kind of wiping it down. So every time you make a mark, it's creating a division on the page. And when you wipe it down, you're unifying it. So you're constantly kind of breaking it apart and putting it back together. That's kind of what's happening in my mind right now. Peter, how long? This drawing today shouldn't take very long. I try to keep my drawings under 2 hours. You're asking about watercolor, and I would, I generally kind of work at the same rate when I'm painting as well. So most paintings that I work on are about 2 hours. Sometimes a little bit more when I'm on location, but that's generally the amount of time that it takes me to really understand a subject with sufficient kind of depth and understanding. All right, so I think I want to continue to play around with the general composition, and I think I need to. I'm at a point where I need to come to a conclusion. Now, I like the placement of the moon here, and I like the scale of that. So some of the things I'm looking at compositionally is the distance between this object and its edges. So we've got basically 4 measurements that we're using, and each one of those is a little bit different. It's closer, a little bit wider, and a little bit wider still, and this almost creates a square. These are pretty much equidistant here to these edges, but with this hillside here, that affects that relationship. So if we ended up placing this hillside, the distance between this as a focal point and the closest edges to that is scaling up as we work our way around. It's not spaced evenly. And that's just, I think a lot of that is being fed by the nature of the reference image and making that decision because the reference image is asymmetrical. I really like placing things in the center. So if anybody's seen my recent work, I posted up on my Instagram page of these power lines, and I love putting, a power line pole right smack in the middle of the composition. So if we're talking about composition rules, I don't really follow any rules, but I do think that it's important to be intentional about your composition. And as part of that intentionality, you ask yourself questions like this. Where is the focal point? Let's look at the relationship between it and its nearest neighbors in terms of their forms. How do we feel about that? Does that feel soothing? Does it feel intentional? Does it create a sense of movement? Does it make it feel static? Does it draw our attention to it, or does it draw away from it? you're going to have your own answers to all of those questions, but it's about asking those questions and again, being intentional at some point. And sometimes what might happen is you say, look, I don't really know if this is right. So there's part of me that's keeping the placement of this moon open for discussion, and I may move it around later as I build up masses down here. So again, that's just kind of what I'm thinking about as I go through. Jane is saying, what's coming up for May? Let me switch to the full screen so you can actually see it. See that portrait right over my shoulder there? I'm going to be doing that next week, and it may be a 2-week portrait. That's done in charcoal, and then I haven't decided yet from there. But I know there's going to be a master copy, because we do a master copy. Kind of once a month. So I got to figure out what that one's going to be, because that's so much fun. All right, let me get back to the drawing. Those are good questions. Lollipop Strawberry question, can you use any paper or cardboard? Absolutely. Like I said, go for it. Whatever material you have, you're going to learn something from it. These are all exercises for me, so I don't put any kind of pressure on myself to make this a drawing that is going to last forever, or, hit any kind of high notes or highlights in my artistic career. Just drawing because drawing is good for the mind and the spirit. All right. Now, I'm intentionally leaving the edges of this moon soft. Use the side of my finger there to kind of smooth things out, try to get rid of any lines. Okay. Now, if you have charcoal powder, graphite powder, that can be a helpful tool for creating a smooth gradation. I prefer not to use those, and I considered it for this, just because I think there's part of me that likes addressing the materials and trying to create a smooth gradation that way, and actually not achieving perfection with it. Because for me, that's so much a part of the actual experience, is that there's atmosphere, there's stuff between ourselves and the subject, and the imperfections on the paper help to convey that. And we're constantly adjusting our gaze to the subject. If we look at the moon and it's bright, we can look away from it and see a dark spot, right? Because it's fatiguing our rods and cones in our retina. And we kind of understand that sky gradient to be a relatively smooth gradation, but the reality of it is that it's pretty gritty. And so I kind of like to have some of that. So we're going to work on that balance here. Before I work on that, though, I do want to, again, just identify my decision about the hillside here. Primarily what I'm looking at is, the placement and now the angle. So you can see that I'm just using the side of the vine charcoal, letting it gently rest on the surface, and I'm just pulling it along. I'm drawing it across the surface to give myself some kind of a rough target. And in this way, I'm looking at the reference image, I'm looking at the drawing kind of at the same time. As I stare at the reference image, I'm using my peripheral vision to see what's playing out on the paper and trying to essentially match those angles. This is coming down a little bit steeper, and I kind of like it. I'm gonna kind of enhance that a little bit. There is this kind of dark area here, and this is all a hillside covered with brush. And look at just allowing the texture of the table underneath that's transferring through the paper, the texture of the paper itself. I'm going to see what that can offer me in terms of suggesting that texture, because then I might be able to use that. And as I contemplate this large mass of trees here, kind of balancing this form over here. All right. Now, knowing that this is vine charcoal, this is all going to wash away. All right. I'm not worried about that. Take it out. I'm not going to protect anything. I've given up trying to protect areas of my drawing because I'm such a slob when I draw that I always have to go back and correct that anyways, and I'm not going to waste my time trying to keep something clean that just can't be, right? So I just work that into my process. I've kind of mapped that out, but I think right now what I want to do is kind of just gradually work on this gradation of sky. And having learned from my previous drawing, again, I'll bring this out. This is the preparatory drawing. This is just the raw paper, the bare gray toned paper. And as I create that gradation upward, it creates some sort of contrast against that moon. But I'm going to see, well, what happens if I actually go a little bit darker here on this one? So instead of at the horizon, at the hillside there, working with that bare paper, I'm going to start with a light tone to it and then gradually get darker as I move up. And again, I'm just getting rid of that hillside. And I'm using my palm intentionally because it's less oily than my fingertips. Those circular motions help. Now I can use my paper towel. And if I go lightly over the moon area, then I don't have to worry about it too much. And now this is starting to give me the foundation I'm looking for. And I'm going to quickly take stock. So one of the things I'm going to have in my mind is you can see this, that blotch there. That's either kind of a slight variation in the paper. It could be because of my greasy fingers messed with the surface. Either way, I'm going to keep that in my mind. I see this little spot here. While I'm talking, I may have sprayed kind of on the surface of the paper. That happens a lot. Again, I don't worry about it. We'll just talk about how to fix it. Let's see. Thank you for sharing that, Patricia. It's awesome that you're drawing every day. If you can draw every day, that's the best. That's the best. Even if it's only for like 20 minutes, right? That is far more, I think, healthy in terms of establishing a habit than kind of binging, which I sometimes do. So where I'll just draw and draw and draw, and then I'll kind of sit back for a few days and not draw again. Okay, so and I have the hard kind of Faber-Castell pit charcoal here. I'm going to just start kind of laying down the charcoal. And now I really need to be looking at the screen in front of me more because just the way the light is hitting, what I'm seeing on the screen that's being captured by the camera overhead is a more accurate, kind of version of the drawing. So you can see I used a razor blade to carve back some of the wood casing to expose more of that core, and I want to use the side of the charcoal as much as possible. Now there are some natural kind of ridges in the paper and being transferred from the table below that I need to contend with. And I'm just starting with a light pressure. I'm stabilizing the pencil with my fingertips and my knuckles here. Again, trying to use the side of the pencil. And I think it's really helpful to try to vary your marks as much as possible. And then in general, I'm going to be targeting the lighter spots to apply a little bit more pressure. So let's see, if I darken this, right? So then I'm going to make something that's really, really uneven, right? Now I have like this light spot that spans between these two darker spots. I can kind of tighten up around here, use a light pressure, move my way across, and try to feather that in a little bit. All right, so there's a kind of a sculptural quality to this whole process. And now if I take a paper towel here, I can kind of blend those two together. And what I'm starting to see is a slight temperature shift between the vine and the compressed charcoal. The compressed charcoal is generally warmer, but sometimes it kind of varies based on the brand and the type of charcoal that you're using. move that out of the way. Here's another dark spot. So I'll just kind of work my way around some of those spots. And by using this overhand grip, I can engage the side of the pencil. And then when I need to really get into a smaller area, so if I'm kind of working up to this line here, I can work broadly and then just kind of roll my hand a little bit onto the tip and then back out to give myself a little bit more control. So as I work in these kind of circular motions and I'm, changing it up with some kind of horizontal hatching, changing up those directions, you might kind of work in clockwise and then, so a clockwise motion here, a counterclockwise motion. The more variety, the better. And that'll help you to create a smoother gradation. Jose, oh, your goal is to be a YouTube art streamer. I would say, just, once you've got the technology figured out, there's a lot of resources online. I had to use a ton of YouTube videos to help me get my setup figured out because, I just needed that. And I'm constantly kind of tweaking and adjusting. And then in terms of the format, really just kind of play around with it. Stream it as a private setting first and give it to friends, watch it yourself and try to put yourself in the shoes of the viewer and see what decisions you might make as a result of that. What you might do to your format, your approach to creating art. I think it's really helpful to, take some time to make sure that you not understand what you're doing from an artistic perspective, but from an instructional perspective. What kind of things do you need to describe? What can you let show? What is engaging? And kind of think back to, early days when you were learning what was most helpful to you and kind of embrace that. Don't worry about what other people are doing, but try to find your unique approach to instruction and being helpful. So I don't know if that's helpful at all, but you try to just treat it all like a work of art where there are many phases you go through. Getting feedback is a really important one. So everybody here gives me feedback and people here at Artist Network give me feedback and I'm constantly kind of refining it. All right, so I don't know if this is just insanely boring, hypnotic, what, as I build up this gradation, but I'm trying to move quickly through it. Just, again, targeting now, like the light spots, and I'm looking at the drawing through blurred eyes, and that helps to see these subtle shifts. One of the other things that I found helpful when looking at gradients is the offset gaze. There are certain aspects of our vision, the cells in our retina, that are more sensitive to value and color shifts just adjacent to our center of focus. And that's something that it took me a while to kind of overcome and really understand is that, we sometimes have this mentality of, saying we just need to look harder and we might kind of focus, really look at those details. But actually, that center of vision that appears in focus is primed for things like texture and detail at the expense of value and color. And so we might not really get an accurate reading of a color or a value when we're looking directly at it. But you'll find that you're going to be more accurate. You'll see value shifts more easily by looking at one spot and putting your attention on what's around it, the adjacent area. So give that a try, because that happens a lot for me, and that's one of the reasons it's helpful to view your work at a distance. So set it up and look at it from a distance, or take a photograph of it and look at the small thumbnail. You're going to change the context of the work because it changes your relationship with those details, and it'll help you to see things that you might not otherwise when you're right up close to it. Hopefully that makes sense. But that indirect gaze, we talk about that a lot here in the show, is really an important one for me. So if I'm looking right here, for example, I look at it in real life, that looks nice and smooth. When I look at it in the small area, when I look at it on the screen in front of me, and I focus on this spot, it looks fine. But when I look here and put my awareness on it, I see kind of a dark blotch that I want to address. So what I'll do is I'll kind of work my way up to it. And see if I can get rid of that spot by darkening the other spots around it. It sounds counterintuitive, but I find that when I look with focus, I'm less accurate. And there are certainly some very impressive works that are highly rendered, very photorealistic works out there. And there's also very kind of impressionistic, atmospheric works out there. And you're going to find your own home either in one of those camps or somewhere in the middle. I'm probably somewhere in the middle. Okay, let me see. Leslie is saying you've got a kind of a dark spot under the moon that you can't get rid of. Yeah, you may. Well, let me show you how I might address that. So right now, very light pressure. I'm just really using my hand to keep the just enough so I can actually move the paper towel around. Because what can happen, and Leslie, I'll kind of use this as an example to show you how I might fix it. So let's see. I say you got a dark spot there and you can't get rid of it. You kind of wipe it down. You're like, can't get rid of it. Here's what I would do. I take a kneaded eraser and I'm going to form it into a little rough tip, and then slowly just kind of tap around it. All right, and it's going to start to lift it off. So I tap a little bit, reshape it so that we're constantly kind of changing that form. And I'm going to keep trying to target that dark area. And that lifts it a bit. And then I'll see if I can smooth it out. So there's a little dark spot here. And what I'll do is, again, with my kneaded eraser, just kind of tap it. And until it kind of works its way in. So hopefully that makes sense. Yeah, and Stephanie, definitely the moon as a three-dimensional object is something that we're going to be thinking about as we work on that towards the end. But I think that's a great observation. Stephanie, close your right eye, squint with your left to wake up your right brain. Nice. When you have a long gradient to fill, start with hatching and cross-hatching at the top, dark area, and then begin to shade with the side of the pencil towards the horizon. That's another great tip. Edie is saying it can be harder to draw when you have all the time in the world than if you have only a little time. Yeah, those are some good comments. For me, like one of the things that I try to focus on when I'm teaching is the power of developing a habit. Because it's, if you're taking a class and you're learning skills, it's certainly possible to leave that class feeling like you understand all of these skills. But then if you're not using it much afterwards, it can be difficult to understand those skills more deeply, because that's ultimately, I think, where the power in learning art fundamentals lies, is in not necessarily building more and more skills on a foundation, but building them into the foundation. So you learn at a fundamental level about shading, about form, value, texture, line, etc. And then the more you practice and really with intention, draw and think about those elements, the more deeply you understand them. And then all of these kind of advanced things, again, they're not layers on top of the foundation. They enrich that foundational understanding. Okay, so that is a relatively smooth gradation. Where I see it could use a little bit more blending, I have this used paper towel that I can kind of just lean in a little bit more and actually kind of draw with this, right? And just keep working that surface. Now, one of the other things I like to see here is there's a bit of what looks like the earth shadow here, where you have that warm glow along the horizon. It gets a little bit darker and cooler, and then it clears up where you get a kind of a more kind of lighter glow and ambience there. And so I think I want to add that to it. This is a very different episode than what we normally do in terms of how the drawing is really coming together. It's all very subtle at this point. We don't often work with these big, broad areas, which is why I thought it would be a fun one to work with. Another thing to help keep you in check as you're building up these gradations is to vary the direction of your mark. So as Stephanie said, building up cross-hatching, it can be very helpful. So I can build a layer of hatch marks running this way, and then I can try to change the direction of the marks. One of the things that can be helpful in that too is also varying the length of those marks. So as you're cross-hatching, you're kind of getting tight, and then open it up, and then kind of back in tight again, open it up, change the direction of your marks. And if you're doing that circularly like this, you're making these circular motions, change that up. So work smaller, and then bigger. And then as I'm doing this, I'm also rolling the pencil in my fingers slowly, so that I'm rounding the tip of the pencil, the charcoal there is continually rounding. I'm not getting these flat spots there. So just continuing to build up these values. Now, I do this a lot in my landscape paintings as well when I'm working on the sky. I spend a lot of time just working on a gradation and really observing the changing temperatures and values as you move from the side of the, I don't want to say horizon. Sometimes it's not the horizon, but basically the farthest point of land to the sky, really observing that gradation and working that. And I would work in oil paints very similarly to this, although I would just be, I would just be laying it on with a brush, and then I would be kind of scumbling, kind of scraping with a palette knife, wiping down with a paper towel, building up more color, etc., and just kind of keep moving through. I want to keep, actually, I'm going to see what happens if I bring the vine charcoal back in. So there, a similar approach to what I would do in paint as well. Lay down like a thinner path across horizontally there. Come back in with a wider one, lighter still, and wider as I go. I don't know if that's really the best approach, but it's what I do, and I work with it. Now back to the compressed charcoal. Again, kind of filling in some of those light spots. And I think rather than have a consistent stripe of darker value here to represent that kind of earth shadow, I'm going to kind of intensify it right here. And you can feel the glow kind of forming already. So to capture a sense of light, you think about a lot of things. If you're painting, you're going to have value in color, and drawing, you're going to have value. But another key element are edges, right? And kind of gradations. The way edges are managed conveys a lot of information to the viewer about the quality of light and atmosphere. These interesting spots that I don't see when I'm looking at it right here, and then they just pop off the screen there in front of me. All right, now let's see how this blends out. So really working that gradation. Now I'm going to keep that. It's darker than the. It's darker than the tone of the paper. Actually, what I'll do is just kind of blend this all into that hillside. I'm seeing kind of a blotchiness down along in here that I want to address. So I'm going to take up some of that. Again, just tapping with the eraser on some of the dark spots. So now with the charcoal, you fill in the light spots. With the eraser, you tap out the dark. Just until we get something that's relatively smooth. And then I can smooth it out with this. Kind of a clean side of the paper towel. All right, so I think that's probably good enough for now. Let's work on that hillside. I do have my blending brush here that I'm going to be using more for that hillside. Because what it can do, like the fine fibers can really kind of push into the paper, and I find that it ends up developing darker spots than I'd like. So I'm going to be saving that for this area here. So I'm going to use, again, the harder charcoal, and then looking at that hillside, I'm going to start by breaking it down into two primary values. I know that I can go darker with this, this whole area, because this hard charcoal doesn't get as dark as the soft charcoal that I have, the generals. And Let me see. Yeah, it's having that line there helps reveal this kind of subtle line that's distracting me. I need to address it because my brain is not letting it go. Okay, that feels a little bit better. All right. Now I need to ask myself, how do I feel about this hillside? So just using the side of the pencil, I'm going to essentially work with some cross hatching, changing up the direction of the marks. I'm not worried about a precise edge. I'm worried primarily about creating a generally even tone. Rolling the pencil in my fingers, you can change up the direction of your marks. So if you're seeing that your marks are noticeably directional, and keep building layers of cross hatching on top of it. All right, so just continuing to build up those values. Before I go any farther, I'm going to wipe this down, let it fill in some of that tooth of the paper, see how it affects the overall tone. And I'm not worried about that hard edge there. We're going to sharpen that up in a little bit. Ooh, a Cezanne, Jane. That is a great one for the next Art of the Steel. Who did we did Van Gogh last. Cezanne he's a powerhouse. Let me think about that. I'll see what images I can find. A lot of it has to do with what royalty-free images I'm able to locate. All right, so I'm just going to keep building up layers of tone here until I found generally an average tone for this. I got to be careful as I move up to that edge. I really want to make sure that these are, if anything, biased towards a horizontal direction for these marks. A vertical direction to these marks along this horizontal edge. I don't want there to be marks that run parallel to that edge, because that will run counter to my goals of creating a sense of atmosphere. It's hard to get in there though. Make sure there's no kind of halo at the bottom there, right along this edge. I'm going to go even darker now. Now, one thing that you could do at this stage, if you don't want a hard line, but you would like to, if you don't want to draw a line, but you want a hard, sharp edge, you can mask it with a piece of paper like this. And that creates a nice sharp edge as well without having scored a line. Because my fear in creating a line that runs parallel to that ridge is that it'll flatten it out. It'll come forward too much. I don't necessarily need sharp edges at this point. All right, let me bring out the blending brush and see how this does. Yeah, I like using this. It's just kind of a fun tool. It makes me feel comfortable because I spend so much time painting. So as I get close to this edge, I'm intentionally kind of moving in a circular path so that I don't end up with a dominant kind of horizontal direction to these marks. And so continuing to reinforce that. And I can be a little bit more kind of careless as I work my way down, but what I like about this brush is that you can really kind of scrub in some of these areas. Sometimes that works against you, but sometimes it really works well. All right, let's see what happens with this. I'm happier with that value. Now let's see. There is a hillside. Let me just create a rough. What I want to avoid here, and compositionally, is this edge here, that angle matching this angle. So I'm going to change that. And if you look at the reference image, there is that natural shift. But it's really easy to end up at a place where those two lines are parallel with one another. So just using the side of the pencil, just blocking this area in. I'm not thinking about trees at this point. I'm just trying to think of what that shape is. So I'm just visualizing that edge, and I'm stopping my marks short on that edge. All right, thank you all for the comments. Let me see if I'm missing anything here. All right, see you later, Edie. The dried weeds are doing a nice job of defining edges. Yes. Yeah, Jane is saying when I take a picture of what I'm working on, I can really see it better as I'm working. Mistakes stand out. Yes. And it's, in my mind, it's all about changing the relationship between you and the work. You're changing up that context, which is really valuable. You're seeing it from a different vantage point, a different context there that allows some of those things to stand out. All right, so we're going to work this landscape. And what I love about this hill here is this alternating sequence where this is dark, this is a little bit lighter, and then there's a gradation here where now this is darker than that. That play in your light and darks is, I think, really a strong compositional opportunity. Okay, how's everybody else's drawing? Are they coming along pretty well? So now I'm working on that foreground. And as I do this, I also want to be now thinking about the contour of that hillside, imagining it rounding across this way. And we can see that it kind of comes down, and then there's another ridge that comes up and around. And so as I'm working my marks here, I'm trying to be mindful of, again, that cross contour. I like that there's a kind of a shift in the line here along that edge. So again, I'm just allowing the tooth of the paper to kind of do its thing by scraping the compressed charcoal across the surface. There's, again, the tooth of the paper, and there's the texture on the table that is being transferred through that could be an advantage to us. And then as I observe where these dark spots are naturally forming, I'm going to let that guide the actual kind of the foliage there. I'm not going to fight it and try to match the reference photo 1-to-1. I just want this to be kind of an impressionistic interpretation of that hillside. So working in the negative space and coming over here into the positive space. So if what I'm trying to imagine are kind of two directions to this hillside. There's a plane that's kind of leading up, and then there's a quality that's kind of coming down. And so there's kind of a crisscross. I'm not turning it so that it's parallel with the direction of the hill there on the drawing. I'm turning it this way. So there's a flat plane that comes back up and around, and then this that comes down this way. And so you can even exaggerate that. You can try to imagine grid lines kind of coming down that hillside, kind of wrapping around this edge and cutting across and over this, right? And that can be helpful in reinforcing that volume. It's all going to be very subtle here. There's not a lot of value contrast. But I'll sometimes do that in places in a landscape that, that are challenging for me to express as a solid structure. So I'll kind of imagine a grid that's overlaying that, and then let that help me to define some of the marks. And try not to overthink it, just kind of reacting to it. This is, it kind of goes with what I was saying last week, that in my mind, all drawing is gesture drawing. We started with big gestures trying to capture the whole scene and very quickly. And now I'm thinking the same way, but just on individual kind of smaller areas of the drawing. So there's, each mark is an expression, a gesture of something. And we're just getting smaller and smaller as we think about what those gestures represent. Getting a little bit darker as I get over to this edge. And now we have this hillside here. I'm going to change the direction of these marks. So I'll kind of put that grid in a little bit earlier. And if you use the side of the pencil, they're not really hard lines that you're going to have to contend with later. Yeah. And then I'll build that foliage from there. And then as we come down here, you can kind of get a sense for how it wraps up in the valley here, it wraps into that other hillside. As I come down here, again, letting that kind of faked grid guide my marks to some degree, in hopes that it builds up more structure here. Hello, Saman. Yours is going well. That's good to hear. Marison. Where's everybody viewing today? I know some of you kind of chimed in earlier, but if you're new, I want to welcome you. Love to hear where you're viewing from. What you're watching is Drawing Together with Artists Network. My name's Scott Maier. We do this every Wednesday, 3 p.m. Eastern. We draw together. We choose a new subject that is designed to advance our skills in particular ways, and we simply enjoy drawing, enjoy practicing with intention so that we advance our skills in whatever art form becomes our primary interest. So I'm just going to darken this whole thing just to wash over all of this. All right, now I think now that I have it kind of roughed in, now I need to address the edge here. And I kind of like what's happening over here where it's a bit broken up. But as I come across towards the center here, I want to gradually sharpen that edge. And so what that really means is I'm starting kind of from the center of the form, working my way up to that edge, and then back down. Rather than drawing a line, I just want a sharp edge. And again, I'm using the hard graphite here because I'm saving the soft one for some of the really kind of expand that value range in that foreground. Heather is saying, I did my sky rather quickly with powdered charcoal. Awesome. So I spent more time on the hills, but I think I went too dark. It's looking muddy. Someone you're from Kurdistan. That's awesome. And then Deborah from Vancouver Island. Woo. Very cool. And then Peter from Denmark. E. Marison from Kentucky. So cool. So Heather, that's an interesting situation that you've got there. My inclination generally is, since I tended to have a bias towards lighter values, a higher key, you might consider leaving that mud and seeing if you can go darker in some areas to clarify that. See what happens. Yeah, let's see. Okay. And then Brent Desart just tuning in. Why did that paper sound so rough? Part of it is I have the microphone placed right next to it. It's actually quite smooth. This is the harder charcoal, so it's a little bit scratchier, and that's what's making a lot of the noise. I had an arm that held my microphone and it broke, so now I just have it sitting on the table, and I need to get a new arm. All right, so I'm gonna go like this. I'm gonna mask this and see what happens with my blending brush here. I guess I don't know if it really did a whole lot, but what I'm looking at again is that edge along that whole hillside. Now in the reference photo, it's a sharp edge the whole way. But what I know from experience and being in the landscape, wherever you're looking is in focus generally, right? So everything else in the field of vision, about 99% of what is actually coming into our eyes is out of focus. Our brain does a very good job at filling in that missing information. So it doesn't feel like, we live in this big blurry world with just this pinhole that's in focus. So I kind of start from that perspective of letting things be a little softer and more atmospheric, and then gradually sharpening to see where that leads the eye. Now, I say this after having spent many, many, many years painting very hard, very clear edges. I did not diffuse edges at all for many years because I tried to create that diffusion just through color relationships, one sharp color against another sharp color. And I didn't really appreciate lost and found edges as much as I could. But painting that other way really helped me in other areas in terms of color mixing. But now I'm really kind of enjoying the idea of creating a sense of atmosphere that I use to then kind of pull the image out of. All right, let me soften this. Gonna blend this area in, and then I'm going to use the brush to, actually that's not really laying in enough color. This is where the blending stump comes in. Am I going dark enough? I think I need to go. So how did I do here? So this is lighter. So I am going darker than my original drawing. Now what I'm doing is I'm just using my blending stump mostly to just kind of pick up charcoal. I need this dark area to kind of pick up charcoal on the blending stump. And I'm going to use this to draw with. And try to create some variation along this edge. So I'm trying to think about the contour of that edge. You can kind of see a certain amount of perspective if you kind of envision the slope to this hillside as we move across here. It's gradually kind of unfolding with kind of shallower angles here, gradually just getting steeper and steeper as we move across. So even though it's very subtle, I want to be thinking in that way to help reinforce the structure of that hillside. And the blending stump's not laying enough down, so I'm going to have to encourage that a little bit with the charcoal. And really kind of try to create some directionality in that hillside to give it some structure. So what Stephanie said earlier about the moon, really thinking of it as a three-dimensional form, is definitely true. And we want to be thinking about that with a landscape. It's really easy to think about this hill as a wall, when in fact it's slanted away from you. The same is with the sky. If you can try to think of the sky not as a wall but as a ceiling, that can sometimes be helpful. Now, it's a little bit harder in this because we're seeing so little of the sky, but if you're ever outdoors painting, then really try to observe that shift in value and color temperature, in scale of your marks, and think about it as being a wall. As a ceiling, not a wall. Going back to Cezanne, he's somebody that I think paid attention to that. Now, he broke his colors up, but he thought of that sky, again, not as a wall, but as a space full of these color patches. And so what you might do in order to express that, again, is paying attention to the direction of your marks and see what evidence you can find in the landscape itself that gives clues to the direction of the hillside. We've got these plants that I'll drop in here. And just a little bit of detail. And I'm not going to be too persnickety here with these. I'm just kind of generally kind of react to these forms. But I'm not really measuring them out. I guess I do like this little tree up here on the horizon. Less is more with these little guys. Start just dropping little dots on there and stop when it's just enough. And actually what I might do is, if I can do a hard edge here with the tip of the pencil without it leaving a darker line, that's the goal. And then here I want to actually sharpen up that edge, just lightly scraping across that surface. So now, again, what I wanted is that shift in edge as we move across there. Let's bring out the soft charcoal. Now, I'm using it, holding this vertically, just creating these short vertical marks along that edge to suggest the trees. All right, now what I'm going to do is block that in, and as I get up to this edge where those trees overlap, I'm actually going to switch to the harder charcoal. I want to start with a softer, not a softer charcoal, but like a lighter mark, a more delicate mark. and kind of just rough in these trees, allowing the tooth of the paper to create those sky holes for the tree. And be thinking about the overall rhythm between them. I'll make that one bigger, but look for variety between those peaks. All right, so there I kind of lightly scribed it, and then I can come back in and just add a few little marks here to finish these trees off. All right, now blending with the brush here, filling in some of that tooth. And now let's see what I can actually, I'm going to lift off a little bit with my finger. And then this is where I can go back in with another layer of dark to give a little bit more depth and dimension to that, to those trees. So it's not just a solid mass. So what you notice is that right up in here, this line of trees is all relatively dark. And so I'm creating this kind of dark path here, looking at the positive and negative spatial relationship between this darker and then a little bit less dark. And then as I kind of work my way through these layers of trees, just kind of dropping in some of these, the kind of the darkest part of these shadows. And let this be gestural. You don't have to really make this super precise if you don't want to. But instead, look at the direction of the marks and generally the placement. So as we move over to the edges, you see the marks kind of wrap down and around a little bit more. As we come across to the center, they're a bit more vertical. They're kind of form the negative spaces between trees. And then yeah, I'll just add a few more little kind of hits in here. I think that's probably good for now in that area. It does look like a little scarecrow here. So Heather, I thought I was using compressed charcoal sticks to do the foreground. So that, yeah, that'll really drop the value. Oh, Michelle, you're using an eyeshadow brush. That's awesome. I've never done that before. I look forward to hearing how that goes. All right. So as I'm working down this area here, I'm thinking about that negative space. So dropping the value in the dark shape behind this hillside with the intention of rendering that hillside. And yeah, I'm going to let that kind of fade off there. And now with this kind of harder foundation underneath, I can again just come on top and recreate what I had done with the hard charcoal. Now I'm doing it with the soft to add a little bit more depth and structure. And what I can be doing is kind of targeting those dark areas that are there already and let that start to suggest the actual bushes that are forming there. And I'm thinking about wrapping up and around the edge of this hill. So as I'm creating those marks really up along that edge, I'm kind of rolling into that edge. And then you can break that up with some of these short vertical marks to create some of that the appearance of those sticks. And I think that that might be too much texture there. So what I'll do is actually the brush works really well for this. Just a light wash over it. And now if I come back in with the dark, I can kind of suggest some of that texture again, but it's a little less contrasty. And then here where the hill is lighter, some of that texture is showing through more. How are we doing on time? We are about an hour and a half in. Not too bad. And then here, where I left that hillside out of focus, I'm going to see what happens if I kind of suggest a sharper focus on this foreground hill in that area. And if anything, kind of soften this foreground hill against that sharper one. So then we create some tension between those two. So this one's a lot of fun. I'm enjoying this one. I hope everyone else is enjoying theirs. I'm just going to let this just become a darker kind of vignette down there. All right, so what I want to do here, I'm going to use the eraser to kind of suggest some texture. So some of these kind of longer, lighter weeds here. So I'm really just kind of tapping with the sharp edge of this. And my hope is that by bringing a few areas of sharpness into this, it's actually going to complete that whole hillside, and I won't have to add much refinement in other areas. Hopefully this makes sense. All right, so then as I come down here, we're kind of looking across that hillside a little bit more. So I want to give a little bit more structure down in here. So what that might mean is that as we wrap around that hillside, we're kind of looking across at these bushes a little bit more. So the marks just get kind of closer and closer together. And that's really mostly what I'm thinking about, is just in general terms like that, rather than thoroughly trying to observe the specific elements. I'm trying to think in gestural terms. And evaluating, because I want to find that right balance where it feels like it's finished enough that we accept it, but not so much that it detracts from the focal point, which is going to be the moon. So I'm just adding a little bit more specificity to some of these bushes, clarifying them a little bit more. And then here again, as we reach that hilltop, things start to wrap around there. So I want to be kind of tightening up the marks a little bit. And when in doubt, just think about what shape am I looking at and what direction do I need to make those marks. All right, so that might be here. What the problem that I have right now is that we have this kind of implied edge that's coming through there, and I don't like how distinct this is. So by lightening this mark here and this mark here, we're starting to see this V form, and I want to kind of break that up. And especially because, and the reason I really want to do that is because it's right along the edge of the composition, and I want to remove anything like that that is attracting attention to the edge. All right, here I can just kind of vignette this and darken that in a little bit. Again, to hopefully kind of pull us into that. All right. So that is probably good for now. Let's get that moon done. Peter Frost, how important is it between light drawings and dark drawings? Vanessa is saying, how did I learn to draw like this? Saman, I love the idea of Scarecrow on a rocket going to the moon. That'd be pretty awesome. I did the rocket a few weeks ago, yeah. Let's see. So Peter, I think if what you're getting at is the key of the drawing, when we're talking about key, it's either going to be like a high key or a low key, or it's going to have like a full range of values. A high key drawing is generally going to have a bias towards lighter values. A low key drawing is going to have a bias towards the darker values. I think it's really up to you. There are a lot of amazing drawings. If you look at Ingres, for example, very high key drawings. He was using very hard materials, very fine, delicate lines, a lot of the white paper showing through. You look at Georges Seurat, and his were very dark. He had a bias towards some of those darker values. Or maybe you want a full range of them. And I think part of that is your sensibility, and as well as what the subject really calls for in that. So, yeah. Oh, yeah. Stephanie, I'm definitely not going to forget the moon. I'm going to be working on that now. I'm kind of just working things up for it. So now, again, I have that kind of light glowing area. And I think what I want to do, I really like, for some reason, I like the idea of going small with it, smaller than what I did in the preparatory sketch. And so what I'm going to do is just kind of with a light touch, using a hard charcoal, I'm going to start closing this in a little bit. Now, if you want to trace a circle on the page, go right ahead. There's nothing wrong with that. But I'm going to go through the process of trying to just visualize that circle. And I'm really just trying to dance around that edge. I'm working in and out from there. And what I think I'll do in terms of really kind of dialing in that circle is I'm going to kind of go by feel. If I can start to define the bottom and the top, the right and the left sides, and then cut off the corners. This is one of the things I'm really worried about, is creating a dark halo around the moon. That's going to happen naturally through the principle of simultaneous contrast. So I don't want to overstate that, because that's going to flatten the three-dimensional quality that Stephanie had mentioned earlier. So I'm really putting a lot of attention on smoothing that gradation away from the moon. And as I go, I'm just going to gradually refine that circle. So this is requiring a little bit more focus. Sorry, I'm not talking quite as much. Again, just trying to think through that placement. Kind of a light blending. And now I'm going to come at it with this eraser. That's loaded with charcoal. And then kind of just essentially sculpt the moon out of this. Now remember, this is the gray toned paper. So I can already feel that I'm kind of calibrating to the value relationships on the page. So you can feel that this is now the lightest light. Remember that horizon line still has a tone applied to it. And this evaluating and kind of estimating a circular form is really tricky. In part because our brains naturally correct things like that. Once you're close to a circle, your brain's going to say, well, it's a circle. So it's going to see it as a circle, but it might be off by a little bit. And it's really screwy because it looks totally wrong from my point of view. This is the danger in working on an inclined plane like this or on a flat surface, is that we're adjusting to the perspective distortion and the relationship between ourselves and the paper. So this looks all sorts of wrong, but when I look at it on the screen, it looks much closer. So that's really what I need to be really focused on. If I don't like that, I think I cut off too much. And this is where I really wish the paper were not taped down. And now it's kind of flat on this side. So I'm going to try to round that out a little bit more. So again, just kind of eyeballing it. But if you want to, you can find something circular that you trace along here to help. But I want to try to avoid that. Okay. So now that that's the white of the paper, just the raw paper, I'm going to get rid of any charcoal that's left on there. Now I can start laying in the moon. So using the side of the pencil, I'm going to start from the center of the form and work my way out. So as Stephanie mentioned, it is a three-dimensional form. So how do we convey that? Especially when we see that it's got such a sharp edge. So what I'm going to do is just with a light touch, kind of work my way from the center out to the edges. And I want a sharper edge, but I don't want there to be a huge value contrast. Because what's going to happen is, just by the nature of the fact that this light charcoal is going to be adjacent to dark charcoal at this edge, that's the principle of simultaneous contrast affecting it. So what simultaneous contrast is the idea that a color or a value is always affected by its surroundings. So you take something light and you put it on a dark background, the light will feel lighter, the dark will feel darker. If you take a green color swatch and you put it on a green background, could likely feel very dull and lifeless. You take that same green and you put it against a red background, the red's going to feel more intense, the green is going to feel more intense. And we don't really have the ability to observe a color or a value in isolation. It's always affected by the environment. And so what happens is, if I make this this moon, if I render this moon as a disk with solid value all the way across, it's going to feel flat in part, and it may actually feel inverted, because as we encroach the edge where the light meets the dark, the light will feel lighter, the dark will feel darker, and it's going to just feel like this flat disk. It almost has like these ridges around the edge. So what I want to be careful about is I want to kind of compensate for that. This edge is sharp, but it's darker, slightly darker in value than what I can achieve in the center of the form. So then I will gradually kind of feather it out towards that edge, make sure that I'm getting my lightest lights in the center of that form, and then hopefully that feels more rounded, right? Oh, Johannes Itten, that would be great. What rules? I don't know, Michelle, if it looks like you had a question about some rules, and I'm not sure what they might have been. All right, so now here I'm going to be kind of mapping out the structure of the form of the moon here. We can see some of these darker craters. I'm kind of thinking in terms of negative space. One of the other things in this moon is that you'll notice that it's more intense near the top and center than at that bottom edge. There's a kind of a light glow. It almost looks like it might be close to an eclipse. It's probably darker here where some of the light is just lightly catching the atmosphere of the Earth before it hits the moon, and it's dropping its value. So that's a fairly minor stuff. But I think the key is to not treat this as a solid shape, as Stephanie mentioned earlier. How can we make this feel like a moon? I'm just going to try to roughly map these darker spots. And then just like with the hillsides here, as you move to the edge of the moon, think about tightening up your marks. All right, so I think we're just about done. And if you need to, if that's too dark still, if there's too much contrast in the moon, you can always kind of wash over it with a light wash of charcoal, and that'll lift some of those dark areas just a bit. So hopefully this works well. I think so. I think that feels kind of like a three-dimensional form. I'm just going to soften that bottom edge just a little bit. Hopefully to kind of anchor that, to suggest the amount of space between us and the moon, the amount of atmosphere there. I'm going to clean off the brush a little bit. There's a little dark mark right there, and I'm kind of contemplating what to do with it, if I'm going to leave it or what. So I'm just softening right around here with the brush, being really careful because I don't want to, again, create like this dark kind of halo around there and make it feel blotchy. All right, so I hope this has been helpful. I appreciate everybody for joining me. I'm going to be working on identifying the next Art of the Steel video, but like I said, for next week, I'm going to be working on a portrait. I'll show that behind me in just a little bit. So again, we meet every Wednesday, 3 p.m. Eastern to draw together. So hopefully you'll join us next time. Tell your friends if they would enjoy this. If you know anybody who just needs to take more time to draw, which is hopefully that's everybody. Tell them this is a safe place to do that. I did post a link at the top of the chat and where you can share your work when you're done on artistnetwork.com. You'll find that show page. You'll also find that in the description below. So if you like this and you haven't already, be sure to like it, share it, do all those fun things, subscribe, smash that like button. But I really appreciate everybody being here and all the helpful tips, suggestions. I love hearing your own experiences. Heather, I hope you're able to continue to work on yours and rescue it from the mud. And Stephanie, I'm grateful for all the comments there. Michelle, happy birthday. Jackie as well. Thank you for joining us. Peter as well. So everybody, I appreciate you all. Have a fantastic week. I will see you all next week. Oh, real quick look here. That portrait. Ooh, squeaky chair. I'll bring that up here. This is what we're working on next week. This portrait here. And there we go. So, yeah, she had a fun, really kind of intense look in the reference image. So I'm having a lot of fun with that. I'm going to keep working on it, but there you have it. Have a fantastic week. See you all next Wednesday.